AFIO Now is presented by Northwest Financial Advisors, where our world revolves around you.
This is Jim Hughes. We are a program of recorded interviews with former U.S. intelligence officers and those who write about them. And today I have an amazing story. Ashlee is a journalist, author, and the co-founder of the acclaimed podcast production studio, Capside Media. He is a correspondent for Outside and Bloomberg Businessweek and a regular contributor to GQ and Popular Science. His first two books were Show Dog and The Taking of K-129. He has a brand new book out yesterday entitled The Impossible Factory. It's the extraordinary story of the aerospace designer Kelly Johnson and Lockheed Martin's Skunk Works. Josh, welcome to Now.
Thanks for having me.
Josh, tell our audience just a little bit about Kelly Johnson's early life, education, and how he got his first job with Lockheed Martin.
Well, Kelly, in a lot of ways, you can trace the history of aviation in the first, three-quarters of the 20th century for this guy. And when he was born in 1910, son of Swedish immigrants. His father left Sweden actually to avoid compulsory military service. He was a pacifist and wanted to start over and pursue a new life in the U.S. and ended up having a large family on the UP of Michigan, and one of his, the seventh of nine children, if I recall, was Kelly. His actual name is Clarence. Clarence Johnson is his given name. And born in 1910, so it's a barnstormer experimental era of aviation. It was biplanes and barnstormers, and he saw a plane at a fair and fell in love with this amazing thing that soared across the sky. And literally from that moment on, as a child, a 7-year-old child, I think, decided that's what he wanted to do. He wanted to not only fly in airplanes, but make them. So this is a time when there is no industry, really. There's no jobs to go and get. And so he just, as a hobby, starts sketching airplanes, reading Tom Swift. He actually makes glider wings and jumps off of fences, starts delivering speeches about aviation, which is then this wildly experimental, unknown field that people didn't take seriously. I mean, no one thought it would become anything, really. But Kelly knew. It just captured his attention in a way that, a lot of us have that moment when we get struck by lightning and realize that we're meant to do something, or if we're lucky, we do. Plenty of people just start one way and end up in a career that they didn't necessarily set out for, but ended up liking. In Kelly's case, it was the thing he felt born to do. And so he goes to the University of Michigan, then one of the two biggest aerospace engineering colleges, Caltech being the other, and studies under a who's who of the early fathers of aviation and aeronautical or aerospace engineering, and is immediately a star pupil. Spends all of his free time in the wind tunnel. Michigan is one of the few places with a wind tunnel. So he's learning all kinds of things about aerodynamics and the way that wings should be shaped and fuselages should be shaped, and basically learned engineering from the ground up, every facet of it. He's not a specialist. He's a generalist. I mean, at that time, I guess everybody was. And then graduates and wants to work in aviation. He wants to go and make airplanes, and it's not easy. This is the Depression. So there are not a lot of jobs. He and one of his best friends drive out to LA, where there's this young company called Lockheed, started by two Scottish immigrant brothers, spelled very differently, and applies for a job because he's heard that Lockheed is doing cool stuff. Lockheed says there aren't any jobs right now. The economy's not very good, and we're not a very big company, but why don't you go back, get your master's degree, and try us next year? And so Kelly does just that. He goes back to Michigan. He gets his master's. He's freelancing for Studebaker. He's actually modifying bodies of cars that race in the Indy 500, shaving seconds off their time. And then, sure enough, the next year, hops back in a car, broke, essentially camping his way across America, shows up in Burbank, where Lockheed was based. And this time they hire him and they make him a tool designer. And so that's how his career starts.
How did Kelly Johnson and Lockheed kind of gain their first real big break? What happened that helped them do that?
So when Kelly got there, a guy named Robert Gross had bought Lockheed's out of bankruptcy. It had been owned by the Detroit Aircraft Company. The brothers had sold it. It ended up in the hands of the Detroit Aircraft Company, and then it went into bankruptcy. And Robert Gross sees an opportunity and buys it with his brother. And they were very good. They had some early promise as a cutting-edge aerospace engineering. There was no space. Airplane engineering company, and they didn't have a lot of money. So they were making some small bets, and Gross one day realizes that they need to make a twin engine airplane. So he starts working on a what would then be a small passenger plane called the Electra, the Model 10, but it's having a lot of problems with stability. And Kelly, this young engineer, says he'd actually studied it at Michigan when he was getting the master's. He realized that this was a plane that could be important, but it wasn't ever going to fly. And so I think he was 26 years old at that time, goes into his boss's office and essentially says, I know what's wrong with this thing. And they're like, yeah, whatever, hotshot. Well, then go back to Michigan and prove it. And they put this model in the car and send Kelly back to Michigan, where he spends several months again wind tunnel testing, and he realizes that the thing that he thought was the problem. And so he fixes it. He puts twin tails on the plane. That's basically his fix. And that becomes one of the trademarks of the early Lockheed planes. They often had twin tails. And so he comes back a hero. He's promoted to engineer, and this plane is a huge hit. So it's Lockheed's first hit. And then when World War II breaks out, the British, this is the next big turn in the story, is that the British come calling to all American aircraft companies at that time, but Lockheed being one of them, and they're looking for a plane to help counter the German threats, especially submarines. And so they see an opportunity. The Electra's now graduated to a slightly bigger version, and they say, like, we could modify this for you and turn it into a bomber. And that becomes the Hudson bomber, which, again, Kelly is put on the project. He goes to England with his boss and all of the executives at Lockheed. They put on a show in front of the Air Corps, the British Air Corps. Their design is shot down, essentially. There are all kinds of reasons. They feel like this has promise, but it's not quite the right thing. And Kelly says, I'll have it fixed by Monday, basically. So he, in the next 72 hours, and as the story goes, doesn't sleep at all. He goes back to his hotel room and tears this plane apart and basically redesigns it bolt for bolt, and comes back and they win the gig. And the British are impressed and want this thing, but they can't believe how young and brash this person is. So they actually pull Gross aside at one point and they're like, do you actually trust this child to do this thing that he's saying? And he's they pat him on the back and say, absolutely, he's our guy. And so Kelly's promoted engineer. He's not given the Hudson Bomber program entirely, but he works under his boss, Hall Hibbard. And this becomes an incredibly valuable plane for the British, helps them nullify the threat to some degree, and then is modified in all kinds of ways, becomes this workhorse of a bomber that serves all over the world and really helps them, develop, if not air superiority, like at least be a force in the skies.
It was the first fighter aircraft that Lockheed and Kelly Johnson created.
So late in the war, Kelly had always realized that, I guess sorry, let me pause. Let me reset that. It's not late in the war. Bombers were obviously not the only aircraft that were going to be important during World War II. It was obvious that fighter planes, in part to shoot down those bombers, were a necessity. In the U.S. going into the war, I should say, there obviously was no military aircraft industry. When the war starts and the U.S. is pulled in, everybody pivots and starts modifying their designs. But there wasn't like the U.S. had a fighter plane to suddenly sell to their allies and then use themselves. And Kelly is asked to help them, Lockheed, come up with its first plane, fighter plane. And the plane that he ends up developing, it's essentially what they've been asked for is an interceptor. So a plane that can go out and intercept the bombers before they reach whatever their eventual target is. This is early, relatively early in the war. It's, I think, 1936 or 1937. And Kelly had seen this coming. So he goes to work and designs what is first called the XP-38. We all know it now as the P-38, one of the most iconic aircrafts. I mean, I'm going to say this a lot about Kelly Johnson's designs, but it's one of the most iconic military aircraft of all time. And it's a really radical design because he extends the nacelles, which are the containers that hold the engines, into booms. So it actually looks like a fuselage with two booms. Anyone who knows the plane knows it very well. If you don't know it, it's an incredibly unique and iconic design. I think still one of the most popular military aircrafts ever made. It has like fan clubs and model builders and t-shirt wearers. And it also has counter rotating propellers. So it's a twin engine. Prior to this plane, designers built their propellers to turn in the same direction, which is fine until the stress of combat. And what opposing fighters know is that under stress, the pilot is going to turn in the direction of his torque, which is the way the propellers are turning. So Kelly counter rotates the propellers so that the P-38 isn't any better going left than it is going right. Prior to that point, every plane was either better going left or better going right. And it took them real world aerial combat to realize that was a problem. And so the P-38, again, like the Hudson bomber, becomes this incredible workhorse. It was also fast, 420 miles an hour, is the fastest fighter plane ever made at that point. He insists that his team run the flight test program, which had never been done before, and this becomes a hallmark of Kelly and the Skunk Works. And it's deployed all over the place. It's involved in all kinds of famous encounters, most famously probably the shooting down of Admiral Yamamoto, the architect of the Pearl Harbor attack, in this incredible daring raid. The U.S. got a hold of intelligence that Yamamoto, who was extremely punctual, like most Japanese, well, in general, but military people, was going to be flying over us, transiting a certain point at a certain time. And so it's decided that the P-38 is the only plane that can fly low enough and far enough and fast enough to make a round trip to that point, shoot down his plane and as many of his escorts as necessary, and get back to base. And it goes off flawlessly. These planes fly like several hundred feet above the ocean for hours, shoot down Yamamoto, lose only one plane, and I believe shot down, I don't know, dozens of Zeros, Japanese Zeros. Yamamoto, considered to be probably one of the turning points of the Pacific War, because this was the strategist for the Japanese Navy. And so it proves again that this isn't just a novel and innovative design. It's a very effective design. And I think, again, you'll see this with a lot of Kelly's planes, which is that they're often radical, shocking looking, and yet incredibly effective, because he's not building them to look cool. He's making them to do a job that other planes can't do. And so it's just another success. He's basically 2 for 2 at this point.
Describe the Army Air Corps' request for a first jet aircraft design, and how did that lead to the creation of the Skunk Works?
So speed had limits with propellers. The P-38 was the fastest plane. It was maxed out at 420 miles an hour. It was pretty widely known that the Germans were working on a new method of propulsion. That would be the jet engine, which we all know and fly jets mostly today. The Germans were working on a jet. So the U.S. and its allies recognized that if the Germans were to get a jet before any of the allied countries had it could be a game changer, that they would just take over the skies. And so Kelly had already been thinking about this. He and his boss, Hal Hibbard, had been toying with the jet design for some time, even as they perfected and made new versions of the P-38. They were always working on the next thing, too. And Kelly's at an air show in Florida, I think it's in 1943, when he's sitting next to one of the generals in the Army Air Corps. The Air Force didn't yet exist. And he's asked if he could make a jet plane. The U.S. badly needs one, basically. And not only can you do it, could you do it quickly? And again, this is a guy, you'll hear this over and over, does not lack confidence, is willing to make bold pronouncements and promises and almost always lives up to them. So sure enough, Kelly's like, yes, I will build you a jet plane and I will do it in 180 days. I will do it in half a year. Mind you, the U.S. did not have a jet engine at this time. There was no such thing as a jet plane. And Kelly actually at that time didn't even know that the British had been working on a jet engine at least. So he gets on a plane, flies back to LA, walks into his boss's office and says, essentially, I have good news and bad news. Like, the good news is the Air Force wants me to make a jet plane and I've been wanting to do that anyway. And I think they were like, what's the bad news? I promised them I would do it in 180 days. At which point, they knew him well enough to not just laugh him out of the office. I think basically what they said, and this is the first stone in the foundation of the Skunk Works, Kelly, you can do this, but this cannot distract from, we're making as many Hudson bombers and P-38s as we can. We cannot divert resources and manpower from Lockheed proper, which is a business that needs to be profitable and is also supporting this war effort. So if you can go off and do this on the side handpick your guys, obviously we'll give you money. The Air Force, if you can do this, the Air Corps is going to pay us plenty. We're not really worried about cash, but you have to do it on your own, and it's like your neck on the line. So Kelly does just that. He walks around, handpicks a team, small team of engineers, small team of production guys, starts in upstairs in the wind tunnel, basically like an area that's not being used for anything, and eventually moves the operation out into a parking lot. This is true. Next to the train tracks, across from this really smelly factory that's always emitting odors, and gets a literal circus tent as the roof, tears apart boxes that had Hudson bomber engines to make desks. It all sounds absurd all these years later, but it's absolutely true. And then in 143 days, makes the XP-80, America's first jet fighter. And at first, it's built around this British engine, but they also simultaneously start their own engine program. So they do ultimately make their own engine too. But the first P-80 that flies is flying a British Goblin jet engine. But he did it. He promised it He promised it in 180 days and did it in 143. And that becomes the model for the Skunk Works, which is, today we use that term to describe a division of all kinds of companies. Every tech company claims to have a Skunk Works. But the idea is some not infinite amount of money, substantial amount of money in an independent unit with a very strong leader, essentially flat management, very little paperwork, and the very now cliched Mark Zuckerberg move fast and break stuff. That's exactly what the Skunk Works was. It was like, this will not be perfect. It won't even be perfect when we fly it for the first time, but it will work and we will fix it by the time it's needed. And that happens time and again during the flight test programs. I mean, part of flight testing is where you identify failures. Kelly's planes did crash sometimes. Pilots were killed occasionally. But more often than not, the mistakes were small and they were fixable very quickly. And they didn't have to have meetings and they didn't have to have post-mortem autopsies. They just worked as fast as they could to make things happen. And I called it the impossible factor because they're often challenged with what seems to be either impossible tasks or impossible timelines, and almost always got there. It's really remarkable.
Just what drove President Eisenhower to request a high altitude reconnaissance aircraft?
So following World War II, after the sides settle and the wall all goes up and the Cold War settles in pretty quickly, and both sides are atomic. So the Soviet Union goes nuclear. Obviously, everyone of a certain age knows this story very well. And our younger listeners and fans at least are aware of what the Cold War was, and that this idea of mutually assured destruction, which was essentially that as long as the power balance was balanced, that the U.S. and the Soviet Union had the same amount of weapons and were relatively certain that they could destroy each other, but not one could best the other, there was harmony in the world. But of course, that wasn't the idea. Both sides were always trying to gain an edge. And for this audience specifically, obviously, I don't have to break any news by saying it was nearly impossible to use human intelligence inside the Soviet Union. Like, it was very easy for Soviet spies to penetrate a free and open democracy. Very difficult for Americans to operate human intelligence inside the Soviet Union. And so we had to use science and technology. And Eisenhower got very nervous that the Soviets, after they detonated the H-bomb, that we had blind spots and that there was a bomber they had developed that was perhaps superior to ours and in greater number to ours. And it was impossible to get the assurance. Like, he was like, how were we surprised by the H-bomb? Why do we not know more about this bomber? And so we need a way to see inside the Soviet Union. And the only way anyone could come up with was overhead surveillance. But like, okay, that sounds like an easy answer. Moscow is one of the most heavily defended locations on the planet. The Soviets were constantly evolving their air defenses. So you needed something that could overfly the Soviet Union high enough that the defenses couldn't reach it, but yet high tech enough to capture imagery that was actually useful. Because like, even if you could fly a plane that went 80,000 feet, there was no guarantee that it could capture imagery that would be useful to the analysts back in the US. So Eisenhower basically says, we need to solve this problem. Who can solve it for me? And again, this gets back to Kelly. He says, we need to do this. It's, of course, an incredibly compartmentalized, highly secret ask and then operation. So some of the people inside the Air Force don't like the idea. It sounds too crazy. Kelly offers up what becomes the U-2 is essentially a glider, a plane that can fly at 70,000 feet for incredibly long distances, and then using equipment built by other contractors, because it wasn't just Lockheed. Obviously, lots of companies played a role in the U-2 and subsequent programs. But essentially, the tool itself, a plane that can fly at 70,000 feet for 10,000 miles and get back to its location with imagery that's useful to analysts. Like, Kelly felt like the answer was this glider, and people saw it and they thought it was crazy. They were like, this little thing, like, it's so flimsy looking and the wings are so long and it's so light. And he's like, this is what you need to be done. This thing will do. And in fact, it did it perfectly. And I should say, by the way, not just that, it was considered too radical. Then he gets the job. Eisenhower himself actually believes in that. Kelly, again, basically says, I will do this in 8 months this time. He needs more than 6 months. He needs 8 months. And he develops an entirely new airframe with an adapted engine and builds it in 8 months. And not only that, it's under budget. So he delivers 20 planes for $22.5 million plus a trainer. The budget had been approved at $35 million. So he just gave them extra planes. And I think, Dick Bissell, maybe it was Trevor Gardner. Someone said this might have been the greatest bargain in U.S. government history. That we think today of government programs, and especially military and contractor programs, as these bloated, wildly expensive, often unnecessarily expensive. I mean, here's a case where Kelly does it on time, substantially under budget, and then doesn't lie to them and pocket the difference, or not even lie to them, but like pad the budgets in order to pad Lockheed's profits. He makes them extra planes and says, here. And there's some funny stuff about this. Happened so fast in under projects at that time, as I understand it, in the agency were relatively new. He wasn't like, there weren't a lot of projects for using black funds. So Kelly had the first few checks mailed to his house because there was no process for getting black funds from the Pentagon, from the agency through Congress into Lockheed. Therefore, they were just mailed to Kelly's house. Eventually, that obviously got more formalized, but it was a real Wild West in those days.
So U-2 begins flying operationally. Were the Soviets able to track the U-2? And why were they not able to shoot one down right away?
So yes, immediately that was tracked. And that wasn't a huge surprise. Obviously, we didn't know for sure because nothing had attempted to overfly at that height. But up to that point, anything that overflew the Soviet Union would be shot down. So there wasn't really a way to I'm sure there were test programs. I know they were bouncing signals off of the moon at one point. Like, the CIA was very good at signal capture and analysis, but no one knew for sure what the Soviets could do. But yeah, so the U-2 on its first flight is tracked basically from the minute it crosses into East Germany. However, it doesn't seem to matter because there's nothing they can do about it. They did scramble planes, but not one missile was fired because they obviously knew it wouldn't matter. And that first flight, which is in June 1956, I believe, overflew airfields, the sub base, factories, nuclear testing sites, and brought back photos so crisp that you could read the street signs. You could see apparently golf balls on the ground. So they saw it. They couldn't do anything about it. It did exactly what it was meant to do. It was another remarkable success. I mean, I think it's looked back on as one of the greatest successes because of what it accomplished, but also how quickly it was built. And it's still, I should say, flying today. Not the exact version that Kelly flew or built, but a version of the U-2 is still flying today. What are we now, 70 years later?
And what happened, and why were the Soviets finally able to shoot down Gary Powers?
Well, we can only imagine the kinds of panics this would have set off in the Soviet leadership because they didn't think of this. Right? Like, it did not occur to them that the U.S. could so quickly develop a plane that would essentially open their country, open their kimono in ways that it never had before. Like, I think they thought they were operating basically with very little risk or worry that they could park their bombers on runways and their sub bases. They weren't preparing for overhead surveillance. So they immediately double efforts to increase the range of their anti-aircraft, both the planes and the missiles themselves. And it takes a bit. I mean, it's 1956 when the first flight happens, but as we get into 57 and 58, into 59, everybody's getting worried on the U.S. side. The flights are decreasing in number. It's pretty apparent to everybody, Kelly especially, that it's only a matter of time until the Russians get to one. However, in 59, Eisenhower has a new worry. He's worried about mobile launching platforms for ICBMs because ICBMs, as long as they're in their in-ground tubes, are very easy to keep track of. But they knew that the Soviets were working on a mobile launching platform, and he was quite worried about confirming if that was true and also seeing if we could capture imagery of them. So he even though the U-2 flights are essentially winding down, because as we will discuss, there's a new platform spinning up. He approves a series of overflights in 1959 to try and capture imagery of the mobile ICBM launch patterns. And on May 5th, 1959, Francis Gary Powers, now quite a famous or infamous person, depending on your perspective, is shot down while overflying Russian territory. He survives the shoot down and is captured and held for more than a year.
What were some of the other theaters and target areas that the U-2 was used to go after the Soviet Union?
Well, like I said, it's still flying today, so we could name many. But at that time, it was very influential in the Cuban Missile Crisis. So it was a U-2 that confirmed there were Soviet missiles on Cuba. It was also used for decades to provide surveillance in places where defenders didn't have muscles. So in 66, we launched 2 top secret missions to capture the French nuclear test at Mururoa Atoll. How do you pronounce that word? Mururoa? I never know. In French Polynesia, Taiwanese pilots were trained to fly the U-2 so that they could overfly China and monitor its nuclear testing. South Korean pilots were trained to fly it over North Korea. It was actually a U-2 with a Taiwanese pilot that collected intelligence on the spy balloon in 2023 as it flew. Sorry, not with a Chinese pilot. It was a U-2, Air Force U-2, that identified the Chinese or helped identify those spy balloons in 2023. So that's a more recent use. But you name a conflict over the last 70 years, and the U-2 probably played a role. It was just that in heavily defended locations with access to the latest Soviet anti-aircraft, it became relatively obsolete. Well, not relatively, actually obsolete. Once Gary Powers was shot out of the air over Russia, it was time for something else if it was going to overfly Russia or its allies.
Air Force's next reconnaissance required?
I'm sorry?
What was the U.S. Air Force's next reconnaissance required?
Oh, okay. Well, basically, that was great, Kelly. And not just Kelly. I mean, these things go out for open bid, but I think essentially everyone assumed Kelly would get this. You built us the thing that no one thought was possible, or at least we thought was very difficult to build. Now we need something that goes higher, so like 100,000 feet, and faster. So Mach 2. The U-2 didn't have to be fast. No one was asking it to be fast. It had to fly long distances, and it had to be high. This next plane not only needs to go from 70,000 to 100,000 feet, which is a massive jump in altitude. You're an astronaut at that point. And by the way, a lot of the U-2 was already flying so high that a lot of the early pressurized suits and astronaut training philosophies were developed. Actually started like U-2 pilots, and then subsequently Blackbird pilots played a role in all that. And the same companies worked on the outfits for Skunk Works pilots that eventually would go on and help found the space program. But anyway, this new need to have a plane that flies 100,000 feet and goes Mach 2 or more is almost an absurd ask. 100,000 feet at up 2 to 3, Mach 2 to 3. Oh, by the way, and it had to have a minimal radar cross section. So whatever you build should ideally be invisible to radar if possible, or as invisible as it can be. So it's essentially saying like, we're asking you for something that you can't build. This is, I think, ultimately where the idea of the Impossible Factory came for, because this plane, which become the first iteration of, is known as the A-12, eventually becomes also the SR-71. A lot of people know it as the Blackbird. I think almost inarguably Kelly's most famous design, maybe the most iconic plane in history. Still the fastest plane ever made. Still probably after the space shuttle, the most popular from a fan perspective. If you go to the Air and Space Museum, it's always got its own section with models and t-shirts and books. And so Kelly goes from the U-2, this glider, very light, no landing gear, extremely large wings, so light that on its first taxi test, it took off accidentally because that's how light it was, to a plane where everything on it was going to have to be invented from scratch, from the shape to the surface to the wiring. Essentially, we're making something that shouldn't exist 50 years from now, but doing it in the late 1950s and early 1960s. He didn't do it in 8 months, but of course he did innovate and create something that's like still revered to this day. The A-12 and then the SR-71 did things that planes aren't doing today, and did these in the 1960s, and really tested Lockheed, I should say. It didn't go as smoothly as the U-2, which was done in 8 months. It also, I should say, both of these planes, most people listening to this podcast will know this, but the creation of Area 51, also known as Groom Lake, was entirely because of these spy plane test programs. So it's Kelly and his test pilot that identify the site that becomes Groom Lake, that becomes Area 51, where the U-2 is tested. And when the A-12 SR-71 is designed and built, it then also goes to Groom Lake for testing. And it's no coincidence that people started seeing flying saucers and unidentified flying objects in the 1950s and 1960s, because suddenly you had planes flying so high that you couldn't see what they were. They were just contrails, or they were just glints of metal off the sun. And so a report spike. And of course, that's not discouraged because these planes were secret. The location was secret. But the plane that comes out of this program, the Oxcart program, the sort of oxymoronic Oxcart program, is just remarkable. Kelly didn't need any validation at this point. He's become Lockheed's chief engineer. He's now designed not only the P-80 and the P-38 and the U-2 and the Constellation. We're not even talking about his civilian planes, but the Constellation, which is probably the most influential passenger plane of the first half of the 20th century. He then makes this thing that blows everybody's mind. It can cruise at Mach 3, fly from one side of the United States to the other in 59 minutes. Just an astounding engineering feat, and does it under Skunk Works processes. And I should say, especially considering the audience of this podcast, I don't know if any of this is possible if the client is the Pentagon and not the agency. The Pentagon likes layers and accountability and paperwork and processes and meetings, and the CIA was willing to trust not just Kelly, plenty of other people around the world, with being able to deliver the thing they were being asked under great speed and secrecy. And therefore, and Kelly was a bullheaded guy, stubborn, cocky, often very difficult. Part of his demand was, I don't answer to a committee. I want to pick up a phone and have one guy on the other side who can approve my budget overages, who can give me more time. And he had that. It was Dick Bissell for these first two programs until Bissell has to resign. And eventually, as the Air Force starts to come in, they were willing to grant him that 4A time. But I think it's worth pointing out that it would have been probably impossible to develop the Blackbird under anything resembling normal Pentagon acquisition and development processes. It could only have happened at the CIA.
Once the AN-12 is successfully tested, where was it based and operationally used?
So one of the, I don't want to say it's sad, but unlike the U-2, the Blackbird had a relatively short shelf life. It did fly for several decades, but operationally, satellites would make it obsolete. Not obsolete, but largely unnecessary within the first decade of its life. But it's dispatched to Kadena Air Force Base in Okinawa, and the first detachment of pilots are trained. So A-12 was the CIA version. It was a single-seater. There was one 2-seat trainer, but otherwise it was a single-seat plane. Those pilots were, as the U-2 pilots were, civilians. So they called it sheep dipping. They would recruit pilots from the Air Force and the Navy, give them discharges. They didn't really know where they were going. Some of them thought they were going to the space program. They weren't totally sure what was happening. They would be shipped off. They couldn't tell their families anything. And then they were told they would now be flying for the CIA in this plane that's going to blow your mind. And so these civilian pilots, these CIA pilots, some of whom later would go back to their commissions. Obviously, none of them were dishonorably discharged. They were given back all their decorations. They were ultimately, at the end of their careers, recognized for all of their years of service. But during this period, they had to be civilians. So the first detachment of A-12 pilots is sent to Kadena. The locals had named you can't keep a plane as audacious and radical looking as the Blackbird's secret. So the locals saw it. It was taking off and landing on it. And they nicknamed it the Habu because that was a black viper on the island. And the plane really does look like a snake. I think Kelly said it looks like a snake that swallowed 3 mice from the front. So it goes to Kadena Air Force Base and begins operational missions over Vietnam, or Southeast Asia, more broadly, I should say.
And why did President Eisenhower decide to kill the AN-12 program and only go with the SR-71?
So ultimately, the A-12, actually, I believe it was Johnson, not Eisenhower.
Excuse me, yes.
Yeah, LBJ. So new president means, of course, new defense secretary. And not to put this all on Robert McNamara, who has a very colorful personality, and people have mixed feelings about McNamara. Even prior to McNamara, there was friction developing inside the Pentagon over, yes, Kelly Johnson is a genius and he's made all these amazing machines for us. However, this isn't how we operate anymore. Like, we can't have this maverick out in Burbank who doesn't have to answer to us and gets his own rules and his own budgets and his own paperwork. And also, I think within the Air Force, there was a lot of resentment that why is the CIA flying planes? We are the Air Force, right? Like, you can tell us all you want that it's about secrecy, but this is literally our job. So it's absurd that the CIA has an Air Force. So you've got a pressure within the Air Force itself. And then inside the DOD, I think we need to get this Kelly guy in line. He's a genius, but he works for us, not the other way around. And so the A-12 being a CIA operated plane allows the lane to stay open that lets Kelly and the agency operate on, Maverick style. Whereas the SR-71, which is the brother to the A-12, which had 2 seats and was slightly bigger, was built for the Air Force. So Kelly had already designed his own. In a way, he set himself up to be phased out because he built the SR-71 for the Air Force. The Air Force takes over that program. Its pilots. It takes over training. It essentially becomes and by the way, the A-12 detachment at Kadena is brought home. An SR-71 detachment run by the Air Force goes there. And it just didn't make sense to be flying both planes. And the SR-71 gave the DOD more control, direct control over the program. Kelly didn't like it, but he wasn't totally surprised. He was much more upset that they never let him build a fighter version.
So Kelly finally decides to step down as chief of Skunk Works, and he actually chose his own successor, Ben Rich, who was one of his principal deputies. What was the first major design success of the Skunk Works under Ben Rich?
So Kelly, yeah, he was given the ability to choose his own successor. It was long thought that Russ Daniel, who'd been his right hand for a long time, would get it, but Russ made a critical mistake while Kelly was hospitalized with some of his. Kelly was plagued with health problems his whole life, ulcers. I mean, weight was an issue with him. He drank too much. And then he had digestive issues and heart issues. But during one of his hospitalizations, he leaves Russ Daniel in charge, and things don't go great. And so when he's turning 65 in the board, which, by the way, he was on the board at that point. He had turned down the job of running Lockheed numerous times. He did not want that job. He's called in and said, it's time for you to step aside. And he says, I want Ben Rich. And Ben was younger than Russ. He was every bit the maverick that Kelly was. He was also very smart. He was also very brash. He was quite funny. He'd like told colorful stories, maybe exaggerated a little more than Kelly did. But importantly, he also had a political side. Kelly was never going to adapt to what the DoD was becoming, this larger, more frustrating, more bureaucratic organization that required all of this paperwork. I mean, there's some really funny stats in the book about like how much paperwork a Kelly Johnson program generated versus how much like a DoD program. It was like 10, 100 times the amount of paper and the meetings. And I think it's pretty inarguable that bureaucracy at a point starts to be detrimental to not only to cost, obviously, but even progress. But Ben at least had the ability to navigate in that world. He could go to the Pentagon, make them feel heard, listen to their BS, put up with because McNamara and then his successors were sometimes rude. I'm sure not just to Kelly and Ben, probably to other contractors. Like you work for us, not the other way around again. And Ben could sort of like nudge him in the ribs and be like, I get it. Don't worry, sir. I'll take care of it. And then go back and be like, screw those guys. We'll do it the way we want to do it. But he could walk both sides of the fence. And he was both a genius, but also just a guy who could operate diplomatically. And I chose to make the last section of my book about Ben Rich and the F-117 because I feel that it's the last thing the Skunk Works built in a version of the Skunk Works that resembles what Kelly had developed. So the idea that was born under that circus tent of like, we work fast, we make mistakes, we make miracles happen, but stay out of my way. I felt like the F-117 was the last thing. So basically, by the time this RFP comes across Ben Rich's desk, they'd been working on stealth since the U-2. The Blackbird is the first real stealth plane. There's stealth all over it. But the problem is Soviet radars have gotten very good. And the appetite for planes getting shot down is very small. So the Pentagon is saying, we need a fighter bomber that has the smallest possible radar signature so that we can cross into very difficult terrain and take out targets. And that's a question and a problem that the Skunk Works have been thinking about for decades. And by the time this RFP comes in, one particular engineer, Dennis Overholzer, who's he's a mathematician, he's a radar expert, he was like a great tennis player in college, one of these really interesting guys, had found this obscure Russian paper that somehow had slipped out of the Soviet Union and wasn't classified. Maybe they didn't know what they had. And it essentially describes the way to make a plane invisible to radar, and that's by building it in facets. And the reason the F-117, which is the plane that comes out of this program, the Nighthawk, looks so outrageous, just as outrageous as the A-12, but in a way that horrified Kelly Johnson, because he called it the hopeless diamond. He said, that thing won't fly. That is like the least aerodynamic, like that's just going to sink to the bottom of the sea, that thing. But what Kelly didn't realize was that computers had come along by this point. And so the F-117, yes, it is not an aerodynamic shape. It is actually impossible for a human to fly that plane on his own. But it had computers on board. It was the first fly-by-wire plane that's constantly making thousands of adjustments every second, every microsecond. So you need a pilot, of course, but the pilot can't do it alone. It would literally fall out of the sky. And this to Kelly was anathema. This was horrifying. He was the guy that could see air. He won both engineering awards, but also artistic awards. Like his planes looked beautiful and they functioned beautifully. This thing functioned beautifully, but it was ugly as hell. And that's because it was built in facets, essentially like think of a prism. And it worked like a prism too, because the radar comes in and hits it, and then it's scattered in a million different directions. And when Ben Rich famously, he tells the story, I don't know that this has actually been told by anyone else. He goes to the Pentagon for his big meeting after it's gone through its radar tests, because they're put head to head against Northrop. Basically, one of you guys is going to win this. Build us your best stealth planes. And the F-117 mops the field with it. Like, exponentially less visible, far and away the better plane. And Ben goes to meet with the Pentagon and get his green light, and they say, what is the radar signature of this thing? And he pulls some ball bearings out of his pocket and rolls them across the conference table. And it goes back to when he's talking to Overholzer and they're coming up with the initial designs. I think someone says, is it the size of a something or an eagle? And he says, no, more like the eagle's eye. And that's in fact what it ends up being. It's essentially invisible to radar. So it's an exponential leap from the Blackbird in a completely different way. It's the first real stealth aircraft. We still see its influence all over the fleet, and its little brothers and big brothers are out there today. But it's built in Burbank under the same. Again, we're not doing it in 8 months. It's 3 or 4 years at this point. But it's also like reinventing on the fly. And Ben was subject to DoD procedures, but he's still able to maintain quite a bit of autonomy and control. And he turns out this plane that, like I said, it's important to say, Kelly hated it, but had to be impressed by what it turned out to do.
And what was the impact of the F-117 on Desert Storm?
So the F-117 gets its first real test in 1991, and it had been flown not in Area 71. It had a new test base at Tonopah, highly secret. Again, heavily covered test squadron out there. They used a whole cover squadron. The F-117s were only brought out at night while they kept these other modified planes on the runway to fool Russian satellites. And then when the Iraq War breaks out in 1991, the F-117 is the literal tip of the spear. And it goes in the first night. Baghdad at that time was thought to be more heavily defended than Moscow. Saddam had pointed everything at the sky because he knew that we could come in numbers. But what was our willingness to take casualties? You know, if the Israelis, and this is an important detail, the emphasis on stealth had a lot to do with Russia's allies in the Israeli air war. Israel lost, I think, 130 planes in a couple of weeks. Like, it was like a bloodbath in the sky because Egypt and Syria, using Russian provided anti-aircraft, just shot American created Israeli fighters out of the sky. So this was a very possible fate in Baghdad. However, here's the F-117, flies in, the city's lit up. These pilots remember it was like the 4th of July, just like missiles and bullets flying all over the place, but somehow none of them were hitting. And so the F-117s that go in that first night hit every target. They take out the communications. They take out most of the important anti-aircraft. Over the duration of that very short war, they fly 2% of the sorties, but do 40% of the damage. It was, like, by any definition, just an outrageous success.
And one final question. What do you think is Kelly Johnson's legacy?
Oh, it's so hard. It was difficult. I think my book is almost 500 pages, and I still feel like I missed a lot of it. What I find so interesting, I was going to say a little sad, but maybe not sad about Kelly, is that he should probably be on the Mount Rushmore of 20th century. I was going to say military, but not really, even just engineers of on a Henry Ford level, because he did something. And I guess this is similar to Ford too, in that he didn't just make machines that were novel and innovative and envelope pushing and, pick your engineering cliche. He developed an entire philosophy that we still subscribe to today, like every tech company in Silicon Valley. When Steve Jobs, as I've been told, and I don't have confirmation of this, I heard set up the Macintosh program at Apple. He went to the Skunk Works and toured because he had been influenced by Kelly's processes. When they set up the design of Pixar, one of the things at Skunk Works that Kelly believed was that you have to tear the walls down. Like, the engineers, the guys who design the thing need to sit next to the people who build it, because if the guys who have to build it find a problem, they can just walk over to this other desk and say, like, here's what's wrong? And then that guy designs it on the fly. And they were cutting processes out. And so this has enabled companies around the world, certainly in Silicon Valley, to this philosophy that I attribute to Kelly to innovate in a variety of fields. But then he also had a tremendous legacy, cast a huge shadow over the Cold War. And maybe a lot of people don't give him the credit he deserved because these planes were built in secret. These were agency programs. These were not DoD programs. And so it wasn't widely known at the time, the story behind the U-2 or the story behind the Blackbird. People just knew once they were declassified how amazing they were. But like, think of a guy who designed propeller planes that influenced World War II, then built a plane that cruises at Mach 3 only 2 decades later, who then in his dying days was such a visionary, or not dying, but at least in his retired years, to the extent that he was able to stay out of it, was predicting drones and Zoom calls like the one we're on. You know, he was a true visionary, but also just a guy who played a tremendous role in military and intelligence, but also in business management and philosophy. So I think he should be a household name, and maybe he will be someday.
Well, the name of the book is The Impossible Factory. It is an extraordinary story, very well told. And I want to thank Josh Dean for a really great interview.
Thank you for having me. I'm just happy the intelligence world is one that I'm very close to and fond of, so I'm happy to come anytime.
AFIO is a small, nonprofit, apolitical, educational organization whose main mission is to help prepare the next generation of intelligence officers to confront the challenges our nation faces in the years ahead. To learn more or support our outreach programs, visit www.afio.com.